The Roots of French Imperialism in Eastern Asia by John F. Cady. Book review. So admittedly, this is a bit of an obscure book to be reviewing here on BookTube. Actually, I shouldn't say it's obscure because I believe it's considered a classic in its field. That is, if you're an academic person and you're writing an academic book on the history of the French in Vietnam, I believe this is considered one of the books that you need to read and that you need to cite in your bibliography. For me, though, I'm not a scholar, but I was interested in this book for a few reasons, and I'll just run through them briefly. First of all, if you've been following me on this channel, you know that I've been interested in 19th century history. I think 19th century history is fascinating because on the one hand, well, because it's a bridge between the pre-modern world and the modern world. So, you know, on one hand, you have a lot of attitudes and lifestyles that are foreign to us nowadays, but on the other hand, you can see where the modern world is being formed. A big part of that, of course, is the colonial history or colonialism. And again, if you've been following me on this channel, you've known that I've reviewed quite a few books about the British Empire. A few books about the British Empire. Now, it's occurred to me while I've been reading about the British Empire that, hey, the French had an empire as well. And then it occurred to me, you know, this is interesting. I think this is interesting. Every school child knows that the French had colonies in Vietnam and Cambodia and Laos. But I never really stopped to ask myself, how did the French get colonies in Vietnam and Cambodia and Laos, in French Indochina, as it's called? I mean, the British had an empire, but the British were very politically stable during the 19th century. So you can easily imagine the British going out and conquering different places, etc. But the French were notoriously politically unstable during the 19th century. I mean, 19th century France is essentially just one major revolution every 20 years. So if the French government couldn't even control its own people, how in the world could they go out and colonize parts of Asia? I began to wonder. But finally, the reason that I ended up reading this book is because I was moving out to Cambodia myself. Cambodia being one of the countries that had been colonized by the French, alongside of Vietnam. Vietnam is where I'm currently living, but I read this book right before moving out to Cambodia. I had gotten the job, I was still in the US at the time, and I decided to put together a reading list. So, having always been interested in the 19th century and the colonial era, I thought it would be interesting to read some books about how the French colonized Southeast Asia. And I went to the internet and I went to Amazon, as you do, and tried to look up some books. And this may or may not surprise you, but there are very few accessible, readable, popular histories on French colonialism in Southeast Asia, particularly in the 19th century. You know, there's probably some stuff about the Dien Bien Phu in the 1950s and stuff like that. But 19th century French colonialism, it's really hard to find any, well, I couldn't find any popular armchair history books aimed at a general audience. I did find some academic titles mentioned, and as I mentioned at the beginning of the video, this one appears to be a classic within its field. The one or two websites I found say Jack Cady's work is a classic, blah, 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 blah. It was published in 1954, which if you know your history, that's the year of Dien Bien Phu. That's the year that the French were finally defeated in Vietnam and also left in Laos and Cambodia as well. So it's a bit of an ironic year for this book to be published. I think that was a coincidence. I think this book had been being written up in the years preceding that, because you don't just write a big work of scholarship like this at the last minute. Sorry, it's actually not that big. It's I don't remember, about 300 pages or something. But you don't write up a work of scholarship at the last minute. I think it had been being written before then. So it was published in 1954. I think there was a revised version published in 1967. It's no longer in bookstores now. I'm not sure it was ever really in popular bookstores. It's an academic book. I think it was aimed at the university market. But in this day and age, it's very easy to track down old used books. So I went to Amazon.com. I was able to track down one of the 1954 versions of this book out of some used public library that no longer wanted it. I believe you can also find this book online on certain websites, but you have to pay like a subscription fee. Because it's an academic book, so it's hidden behind some of these paywalls of sites that have academic materials on them. But with any luck, if you're at all interested, you should be able to find a used copy on Amazon.com or something. I was. Okay, so this is an academic book. It's not academic in the sense that it was difficult to read. It's readable enough in the sense that it's straightforward, but it's got that dry academic tone. And I mean, this was never meant to be a popular history. This was never meant to be a bestseller. And it's got footnotes on every page. Every page has footnotes. It's often multiple footnotes. So it's one of those books where you're reading it and you're kind of like, okay, down to the footnote and then back up to the text and down to the footnote and then back up to the text. Drives me nuts. And, some people say, well, just skip the footnotes. I can't skip them. If they're down there, they're going to be distracting me. Most of these footnotes, I don't know why they weren't integrated into the text. Because I think they could easily have been integrated into the text. I suspect that there's some sort of academic convention about what goes in the footnote and what goes in the text that I'm not aware of. But in terms of like readability, these could have easily just been integrated into the text and it would have saved the reader going up and down. But again, I think this is meant to be an academic book, so it's not so much concerned about how easy this is to read. Anyways, let's get into the content of this book a little bit. The author posits two dual reasons for French imperialism in Asia. One is the need to enhance French prestige, especially in light of the growing British Empire in Asia. So the French saw that the British were getting a big empire in Asia, and they thought, hey, we need to get in on this. French prestige is on the line. But the second thing is agitation by French Catholic missionaries who wanted to establish pro-Christian regimes in Asia. Now, this is where we get into French history. This happened during the reign of Napoleon III. And if you know your French history, Napoleon III was, I believe, the nephew or grandnephew of the original Napoleon. He came to power in a coup d'etat in, I think it was 1851. And he always had a rather precarious grip on power because the monarchists didn't like him, because he wasn't a legitimate king. He wasn't from the sacred line of the French royal family. He was a Bonapartist. The Napoleonic family were outsiders who just had grabbed power. And during this time in French history, the Republicans and the Radicals were a big force, and they didn't like him because he was ruling like an autocrat. So on the one hand, the conservative monarchists don't like him, and on the other hand, the Republicans don't like him. So how is he going to maintain power? Well, his idea, as it turns out, was to maintain power by appealing to France's large Catholic population. So he had this idea that he was going to make the Catholics happy by setting up Catholic empires in different parts of the globe. Now, as it turns out, part of this resulted in the debacle in Mexico. Remember you might remember this from your history classes, where the French attempted to establish Maximilian as Emperor of Mexico and got defeated. I was going to say got defeated at Cinco de Mayo, but actually that's not right, isn't it? Cinco de Mayo had something to do with it. Maybe it was one of the early battles. I don't know. We're not talking about Mexico in this review. But the other thing then was going into Southeast Asia. Now, there were a lot of French Catholic missionaries who were trying to spread the gospel in Asia at that time, in China and in Korea and in Vietnam, in Indochina. The bulk of this book, actually, the majority of this book does not actually deal with Vietnam, but with China. So it turns out that the French initially wanted to set up an empire in China, much like the British were doing. You know, the British were carving out concession areas in China. The French wanted in on that. And so the bulk of the book describes how they were trying to get in on that, and describes how they were competing with other Western powers for influence in China. Now, here's where the book maybe gets a little bit into the weeds, because author John Cady, in order to tell the story, feels like he needs to talk about what the French and British and Russian diplomats were all doing into China. Were all doing in China, in order to kind of set the stage for what the French were competing against. So yeah, it's a little bit ironic. I thought I was getting into this book to read about the history of Vietnam, but the French in Vietnam is just like at the tail end of this book. Most of it is actually describing the French trying to get into China and then dealing with the French and British and Russians who are already there. Now, again, if you know 19th century history, you know that the French and the British, throughout the 19th century, after the Napoleonic Wars, either had a rivalry going, but then occasionally they would team up at various points. And one of the points that they teamed up was the Arrow War, also known as the Second Opium War, which I was just talking about on this channel recently because I was reviewing a historical fiction book about the Second Opium War called Flashman and the Dragon. So I had been reading that book, and I had been familiar with the story of the French and British armies marching on Peking, and then that was all recounted again in this book. Here, of course, this book is a proper history, and it talks about how the French and British ended up in this alliance in the Second Opium War. In fact, he spends a whole chapter describing all the diplomatic negotiation that led to Britain and France forming an alliance during the Second Opium War. This book focuses heavily on the European reaction. Sorry, this book also focuses heavily on the European reaction to the Taiping Rebellion, which is again something I talked about with the historical fiction Flashman and the Dragon. So it was interesting for me to read this book after having read the historical fiction and find out some of the real history behind it. And then in the end, once the French failed to establish a stronghold in China or carve out any area of concessions, then they went into Indochina, Vietnam. Now, The French missionaries had been advocating, because the French missionaries had been in Korea and they had been in China and they'd been in Vietnam, and they'd been either thwarted in their attempts to proselytize or been persecuted in these countries. So they wanted the French army to come in and protect them. And to do so, they sent the French army maps of where the weak points were, what roads to take, so they were inside the country and were essentially giving information about all the tactical points to the French military. And I'm reading this book and I'm thinking, boy, no wonder people don't like missionaries. Which is unfair, I know, because we've moved past that point in church history. We're no longer at that point now. But it is part of church history, isn't it? That they were taking advantage of being in these countries to spread the word of God, and then while they were doing that, they were also passing military information onto the French army, and then the French army came in. Actually, this was another interesting thing I learned from this book. The expedition to Vietnam initially was not the French. It was a joint French-Spanish expedition. Two Catholic countries who were going in to protect Catholic missionaries. And the Spanish actually, their contingent largely consisted of Filipinos, because Spain still controlled the Philippines at this point. This was back in the 1860s. So, let me back up a minute. It's amazing to me that this book was written back in 1954. It was written in 1954, and it was talking about the French in Vietnam in the 1860s, because this book seems to highlight in advance all of the problems that the Americans would have in Vietnam. And it came out all the way back in 1954. And you think, oh, why didn't anyone pay attention to this book? Why weren't Kennedy's advisors reading this book to see what happened to the French? Because it seemed like anybody who wanted to see what a disaster this American involvement in Vietnam would turn out to be could have found it from this book. Because what happened was, the missionaries are sending back all these reports to Napoleon saying, please come in and invade Vietnam, please come in and invade. They want you to invade. They hate their rulers. They want the French to come in and invade and free them. Quoting from the book now, this is from page 178 and 179. Abbe Hook, a former Lazarus missionary, had written and spoken volubly on the subject, finally gaining a hearing at court. In a secret memorandum prepared for Louis Napoleon in January 1857, Hook argued that the suffering animite is the old term for Vietnamese, the suffering animite population would receive the French as liberators and benefactors, and only a short time would be required to make them entirely Catholic. And so Napoleon III thinks, great, I'll come in with my army, they'll greet me as liberators, everyone will become Catholic, Vietnamese will love me, I'll be so popular in France with the Catholics. And then he invades, and it turns out that the Vietnamese did not actually want to be conquered by the French. Their desire to be conquered by a foreign French army had been greatly exaggerated by the missionaries. And so the whole thing ends up turning into a disaster. And then quoting from another part of the book, from page 277, during these years, the 1860s, Saigon was a prestige liability for the Emperor Napoleon III, rather than an asset. One informed spokesman in 1864 leveled a trenchant attack against the whole Indochina venture on the ground that it had not been thought out in advance in terms of defined objectives and the difficulties and sacrifices entailed. This book was published in 1954, but boy, is that not the American involvement in Vietnam exactly, huh? It had not been thought out in advance in terms of the objectives and difficulties and sacrifices entailed. And I probably don't even need to mention how much this parallels the Iraq War, huh? I mean, going back to that earlier quote, the suffering animite population would receive the French as liberators and benefactors, and only a short time would be required to make them entirely Catholic. I mean, isn't that what we were told about Iraq, right? Almost in those words exactly. We will be welcomed as liberators, the war will be over in just a short time. And this book was written all the way back in 1954. It's amazing how history repeats itself if only people would pay attention. Just makes you wonder how many of these debacles we could have saved ourselves from. Anyways, sorry, that's me editorializing a little bit on the book. Talking about the readability of the book. Oh, sorry. Yeah. Jumping back just a little bit. The book actually finishes before the French established control of Indochina. As the book finishes in the 1860s, the French have control of Saigon and the Mekong Delta area, so like the very southern tip of Vietnam. They do not have control of the majority of Vietnam or Cambodia or Laos at the end of this book. That apparently, according to Wikipedia, happens in the 1880s. But this book stops just right at the beginning of the 1880s, which I guess is what's in the title. Huh? This is about the roots of French imperialism. So you're just learning how it just got started. I was a little bit disappointed that I didn't even learn how the whole of Vietnam came under French control, much less Cambodia and Laos. But again, the book is just the roots. So it's just about the French. Well, it's primarily about the French in China. But then at the end, it's about the French and Spanish expedition to conquer Saigon. Okay. Talking about readability, I complained about the footnotes earlier. And it is written in a dry academic tone. That being said, I found some chapters very interesting. So the chapters, the quotes I just mentioned about the French conquest of Saigon and the political fallout back home, I thought that was very interesting. I also thought was very interesting Cade's description of the politics in France during the 1850s and 1860s, specifically the different political factions that Louis Napoleon was navigating between. So the Orleanist monarchy, the conflict between the liberal Catholicism and conservative Catholicism, Louis Napoleon's plans to undertake more ventures in order to get more Catholic support. I thought all of that was very interesting. There were other parts which I did not find so interesting, and these were mostly the parts to do with China. John Cady, and again this is an academic work, and it's meant to be a work of scholarship that is filling in the gaps. It's not meant to be a popular history. But he thinks it's necessary to kind of trace all these long correspondences between diplomats in China. So you've got these corresponding letters going back and forth between the French and Chinese diplomats in China, or between the French and the British leading up to the French and British alliance in the Second the Second Opium War, also known as the Arrow War. And that I did not find so interesting. I mean, it was I could read it. It wasn't like it was It wasn't like it was dense academic prose that I couldn't make my way through. It was readable, I just found it boring. But I sucked it up and read it. So, yeah, in conclusion, if you're interested in the history of French in Vietnam, particularly in the 19th century, this book is worth checking out. It is academic, it is a little bit dry, but it will educate you, definitely. If you're not interested in history, don't bother with this one. I don't know why I'm even saying that. Nobody is still watching this review who's not interested in history. Like I said at the beginning of this review, I could not find any popular history on the French. Actually, I take that back. I did find one, which is Colonial Cambodia's Bad Frenchmen. I'll be reviewing that book on this blog someday. Sorry, on this YouTube channel someday. Aside from that, I couldn't find any popular histories on the French in Indochina. If you know of any, like, good, readable, engaging, popular histories, by all means let me know in the comments. I couldn't find any, so I just read this instead, and it was dry, but it was informative.